There's been a joint exhibit between the two universities, so this is very exciting. All right, thank you. So for those of you that aren't familiar with what art pierres are, this is going to be a beautiful exhibit of hand-stitched patchwork tapestries that were sewn at the time of the Pinochet dictatorship in Chile by women to try and educate a larger public, not only in Chile, but also to an international crowd to understand the triumphs, the challenges, and the conflicts going on under the Pinochet dictatorship. And this particular collection was smuggled out by a worker at a fair trade pioneer from Philadelphia, Jubilee Crafts, Melissa Moy. So the very political ones had to sort of be smuggled out because it was actually a form, viewed as a form of anti-patriotism, of betraying the nation from the viewpoint of the Pinochet dictatorship to say anything that critiqued the dictatorship. And so it was dangerous to make these. So it's important to understand the bravery of these women to make these arpilleras. And eventually, once these two exhibits are over, these Chilean arpilleras are going to make their way home. So they're going back to the Memory Museum in Santiago. So this is the last tour of education of the US public. So it's pretty historic. I want to take a few minutes to thank a lot of people. The first group of people I'd like to thank are the team at Potsdam that made this possible. So MJ Heisey, if you could just stand up. Liliana, Liliana, if you're here. Oscar, I can see you in the, yes, Oscar too. MJ actually was a director of Jubilee Crafts, and she's the reason why we have this collection here in the North Country. And Lily and Oscar, if you want to find out more about them, go to forgingmemory.org. There's a new podcast that tells you about their history under the Pinochet dictatorship and before the Pinochet dictatorship under the Allende regime. And they've been instrumental in this project from the beginning. I'd also like to thank the gallery staff. So both the Gibson gallery staff, April Vassar-Dean and Rami Sebald, who were instrumental in getting the exhibit going on SUNY Potsdam's side. Come on in, don't be shy. Yes, here they are. And they're all together because Kathy Tedford and Carol Matthew there are from the SLU side of the Brush Gallery. So this wouldn't have happened without them too. So I worked on the SLU side, and a lot of my students really helped create content for the website, which I already mentioned, forgingmemory.org. I'm going to do another plug there. So if there are any students from these classes, please don't be shy to stand up, and I can see some of them in the audience. So if you were in my Cold War class back last spring at 4007, I'm seeing someone standing up right here. Go ahead. If you were in, and I think I saw Garnet. Come on, don't be shy. From last semester, the History 368, Chile's Dirty War, History 395 at Potsdam, Dictatorship and Democracy, and the History 4008. There's some students from this semester. They've all been very important parts of making this project a reality, so I just wanted to acknowledge them. I'd also like to acknowledge the funders. So we wouldn't be having this opening speaker, I'm going to tell you how wonderful she is in a second, without the Arts Collaborative. And you're also going to get free food and some music afterwards, also sponsored by the Arts Collaborative. We've also had a lot of help in terms of making this a reality here at SLU from the Brush Gallery, of donating the time and the resources to put this show up. The digital initiative has also been instrumental. Eric Williams-Bergen and Natalie Canerou in making the website a reality. The history department has helped fund a student research position. CIIS helped fund a research abroad trip in Chile over the summer. So all of these parts of SLU helped make this a reality. So thank you for your help. I just want to mention that this is one in a very complex line of events related to this exhibit. So we've already had an opening at SUNY Potsdam, but we're also going to have, in connection with modern languages, and I think I'm seeing some students in some classes, perhaps from Professor White's class, there's going to be a modern languages film festival, and there is going to be this Thursday a wonderful film from Chile by a very famous Chilean director. Nostalgia de la Luz is the name of it. 7 p.m. in Carnegie 10 if you're interested in learning more about this period. There's also going to be a return of someone who did a beautiful art piece that's hanging in ODY. I don't know. Some of you know what it is, but there's the two murals that are on display between the periodical section, and that was done by Francisco Letelier. And he is a very important muralist, internationally renowned. He's also the son of a very famous politician from Chile. He was the Chilean ambassador to the US under Salvador Allende. And he was also famous for being assassinated on US ground. So it was a form of international terrorism in DC, 1976. The long arm of Pinochet reached out and blew up his car. And he and Ronnie Moffett perished in that attack. And they named a mural brigade after him. 2 of his sons participated. So did a number of SLU students back in 1989. And so he's coming back. He's going to do a new mural. And so week of March 25th, he's going to be over on SUNY Potsdam's campus. And we have a number of SUNY Potsdam students that are going to be helping. There's one SLU student that's sitting in the middle, if you want to just stand up for a second, Oscar. He's going to be helping. He's representing SLU for us. So thank you for doing that, Oscar. And Letelier is going to be coming here, and in this very room is going to share with you his stories about art and activism in Latin America. And on March 27th, 7 p.m. The last thing I wanted to mention is the fact that at the end of that week, on March 29th at SUNY Potsdam's campus, right across from the Gibson Gallery, there's going to be a big fiesta with food, a big Latin ensemble band, and a celebration of the end of the mural, if you want to take a look at it. So enough plugs. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about Katie, very, very briefly, so she has more time to talk. So I mentioned Letelier and Orlando. So he also had a wife, a very important feminist activist who worked at the same DC think tank, IPS, as her husband, and became a very important activist and also importer of the art of arpilleras to the United States. And just like you, not too many years ago, Katie was sitting as an undergraduate at Duke University, listening to a very moving speech by Isabel, talking about her experiences. And that inspired her so much, maybe you'll be inspired by Katie, I see a lot of undergrads here, that she actually went to Washington, D.C. to work at IPS right after graduating. And it sort of started a lifelong love affair, I'd say, with Chile and studying Chile. She did a wonderful book on the Chilean left that came out of her dissertation. And she's also been working on memory more recently, not only in Chile, but in other places. So she's done a great book, Politics and the Art of Commemoration, Memorials to Struggle in Latin America and Spain. And she's also done and co-edited a piece on the politics of memory in Chile. And more recently, she's been telling me that she's been working on memory and memorials in the south of the United States. So she doesn't stop at the international borders. So she's no borders. She has no borders. What we're going to do now is have her discuss her experiences with memory and Chile. And I'm going to shut off this microphone so we don't get any feedback.
Wow. Well, thank you all for coming out and well, I guess you're used to this cold. I grew up in Houston in Texas, and even though I've been in the Northeast for a long time, I've not been in the North Country, and it's serious. So thank you for being here. And I have someone really important to thank, Tamara Feinstein. She's done just an incredible job on the SLU. I have to get used to the SLU side for getting this whole ambitious thing together, including the Forging Memory website and having so many students involved, and then forging a really important alliance, which many of us don't do very well, even when we have these great universities right next door. So I'm so happy this has happened. And I really want to thank Lilian Trevisan and MJ, Heisey, and Oscar, and it's really, really nice for me to be here. I'm deeply honored to be here, to be invited. The Arpilleras hold a very special place for me. As Tamara said, I did, as a person about the same age as you, start to work with Isabel Atelier, who really was, in the 1980s here in the United States, a very important leader in human rights and a real feminist. And she had this Third World Women's Project where she would bring women from the global south whose voices are never heard in the United States. And that included a very well-known early arpillerista, Anita Diaz, or Anita Gonzalez, who traveled talking about what was going on in Chile and explaining the arpilleras. And we also did this show in the 80s of Isabel's collection of arpilleras at the Martin Luther King Library, the public library in DC. And many of those arpilleras are the ones that now form the permanent collection at the Museo de la Memoria. So yes, arpilleras were part of my life at about the same age as of you all, and so it really is great. And Francisco Letelier, let me tell you, you really want to come and hear him. He's dynamic. I actually had him at Vassar about 3 years ago. Students loved him, and so I really encourage you to take advantage of his return here. He must have been in '89, he must have been 24 or 5, something like that, when he was doing this Orlando Letelier Brigade. And he's gotten very well known around the United States and in the Americas for the murals he does. He lives out in Venice, California. He's a very hip Chilean American and does these great collective projects there. So come hear him. Before I start, I want to thank a colleague of mine, a young colleague who's a doctoral candidate in sociology, Manuela Badia, who did some of the current research with me for this talk, and she and I are co-authoring a piece that's very much based on the talk I'm giving tonight. She's finishing her dissertation in Chile. And I also, part of my talk, which focuses on the Estadio Nacional, the National Stadium in Chile, borrows from a forthcoming chapter I'm doing with my friend and colleague Marita Sturken at NYU. So I want to thank both of them. They're here very present. So as Tamara said, my work now has been very much on the politics of memory and how countries come to terms with very difficult pasts, both very recent difficult pasts and not so recent pasts. And I've focused on memorials and on museums of memory in Latin America, and now increasingly in the United States, particularly the state of Texas, where I'm from. So this means that I've done more thinking recently about the removals of memorials as well as the creations of them. Today, though, I'm mainly focusing on Chile, but I certainly invite in the Q&A a discussion of the debates around removing the Confederate memorials. It's something I've been thinking and writing a little bit about. So in 2010, Chile's Museum of Memory and Human Rights opened its doors. Should I turn this light? Can you all see this very well? Can you see well? Okay. So it opened in 2010, and it's an official museum that was established by Chile's then outgoing center-left president, Michelle Bachelet. The museum focuses on the Chilean dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, the brutal 1973 military attack on the presidential palace, the death of President Salvador Allende, the massive repression in the early period, and the institutionalization of the dictatorship over 17 years and the lasting transformation of society there. Over the 8 years since the opening of the museum, visitors have grown astronomically to more than 10,000 a month, and the kinds of visitors that go have moved from what were at first largely international and national human rights and leftist activists to the now massive numbers of visitors of all kinds, primarily Chilean school children and Chilean families, particularly from working in lower middle class neighborhoods near the museum. It's one of the most visited museums in the country. From time to time, the museo is also the locus for political attack. Just a few months ago, Chile's then newly appointed Minister of Culture, Mauricio Rojas, caused an uproar. The public learned that Rojas's co-authored 2015 book, Diálogos con Versos, in it he had disparaged the museum. He wrote, and this is my translation, forgive me, to those of you who can. He wrote, "The Museum of Memory is a stage spectacle whose purpose, which without a doubt it accomplishes, is to hit the spectators, to leave them aghast, to impede their reason. It's a manipulation of history. It's a shameful and false account of a national tragedy that affected so many of us brutally and harshly." Rojas's nasty assertions about the museum triggered a mass outcry, championed by well-known Chilean artists, writers, actors, and musicians, and joined by civil society across generations and social class. It forced the minister's resignation, and at the end of that week, thousands of Chileans gathered for a concert in defense of the museum, staged in the outdoor amphitheater that frames the museo's entrance. In these 8 years since the museum's opening, the site has gained the respect and support of a broad swath of the Chilean public. It's embraced and claimed as Chile's own. This is not to say that memories of the coup and the dictatorship are undivided. Opposing political beliefs and dispositions clearly influence the ways Chileans view the atrocious past. Nevertheless, I want to argue to you today that the defense of the museum speaks to the power of memory as possibility, as foundational to the ways that collectivities understand violence and injustice in order to imagine otherwise. As an official site, the Chilean Museum is in fact quite traditional in its approach to the dictatorial past, borrowing from models that include Holocaust museums around the world, the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, South Africa, and others. In contrast, there are many Chilean memory sites that are more organic and grassroots inspired. They are also sites of memory activism toward political and social transformations in the here and now. Sites of memory, however fitfully, open the possibilities for meaningful dialogue and connection regarding the legacies of state-sponsored political repression, racism, and imperialism, and many memorial spaces also integrate activism directly into their work. So here I'm going to first reflect on sites of memory across the Americas, South and North, and then focus on Chilean sites. The region writ large, Latin America, is a recognized trailblazer of what in social sciences has been termed transitional justice, that is, political and policy agendas in the aftermath of dictatorships and conflict that attempt to confront the past and hold past human rights violators accountable for their criminality. Trials, truth commissions, forensics work, and monetary and symbolic reparations like memorials and museums of memory have been cornerstones of governance and statecraft in several post-military, post-armed conflict Latin American regimes. When it comes to the number of prosecutions of former human rights violators, Latin America heads the world, and it's no coincidence that the first prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is an Argentine jurist. I think all this comes from a combination of persistent local, national, and international human rights movement demands and the long legalist traditions that characterize the Americas. Yet it's also the case that all this is embedded in deep traditions of imperial, colonialist, class, and racist violence, interwoven through the Americas, North and South. In point of fact, racism and coloniality are structured into the very institutions theoretically meant to protect rights. In addition, as political scientist Bronwyn Liebau has suggested, transitional justice approaches basically adopt a time frame in which it's assumed that there was some form of past violence, some state of exception that must and can now be righted, when in fact, systematic human rights violations were and continue to be the norm against both dissidents and the structurally marginalized. I want to argue that many recent memorial movements in the United States, as well as in Latin America, are countering and confronting past and ongoing violences. New commemorative projects led primarily by grassroots activists and public scholars expose sites of violent memory and injustice around which there's been intimidation and unease over several generations. For many such efforts, exposure posed risk then and now for different sides unequally. I would argue that memorializing can become a defiant political act, a form of reckoning with violent haunting. There's nothing easy or straightforward about memorialization processes. We must explore head-on the significant silences, fear, and denial of the relationships between violence past and present, as well as the persistent invisibility of significant historical atrocities all over the world and in our own communities. Clearly, throughout the US, we're witnessing citizen initiatives to remove monuments and memorials, to mark formerly invisible sites of violence, and to establish museums of memory that address atrocious pasts in relation to the present. We're also seeing how charged several of these initiatives are and how offensive some people find such demands for a reckoning. In Latin America, there's been an explosion of new memorial sites and museums of memory, and Chile's been among the countries at the forefront of these very processes. The demands come from the grassroots, from survivors of violations, families of victims, neighborhood groups, and new generations of political activists organizing to ensure that spaces that were once the site of horrendous violence gain national heritage status. There's reason to be skeptical of the explosion of memorialization and the institutionalization of memorial processes within the state. Many see the phenomenon as evidence in Chile, for example, that Chilean justice has fallen short, that past perpetrators of human rights crimes are not held accountable, that the few who are lounge in special prisons with short sentences, and therefore that memorialization can be a cheap substitute for far less threatening substitute to actual justice. Moreover, applications and approvals for state-funded memorials in Chile generally downplay the political subjectivity of those who are being memorialized, the fact that many who were killed were Chilean revolutionaries, for example. So there is reason for skepticism. Yet human rights and political activists, including torture survivors and the families of loved ones whose cases are in fact being processed through the courts, can find such processes slow and exclusionary, rendered to the professionals in ways that do not invite their activism or expression. Memorial activism becomes a way to channel grief actively, to denounce the criminality of the dictatorship, and to champion past lives, to educate new generations and publics. In addition, the public subjectivities and accounts of the men and women who were tortured, murdered, and disappeared are becoming more visible through imagery and text, through the guides, artists, teachers, and organizers who are the protagonists of the memorial sites. From their study and work in the sites, new generations particularly are finding meaning and inspiration from the past struggles that are embodied in the sites toward ongoing struggles in the here and now. While there are several important sites doing work in Chile, I'm going to focus on two of them, Londres 38, an ex-clandestine center of detention, torture, and disappearance in downtown Santiago, and the Estadio Nacional Memoria Nacional, Chile's national stadium, that was, for a few months immediately following the 1973 coup, the dictatorship's largest center for detention, torture, and death. I've chosen these two sites because they're among the ones I've had the privilege of fairly close connection to over the past few years, both as a student of memorials and as a professor who's taken her US and Chilean university students to the sites at different points, so they have a special meaning for me. Londres 38 was one of the most important clandestine detention centers to Chile's repressive apparatus, the DINA, a site where from 1973 to 74, approximately 98 people were assassinated or disappeared. It's located very centrally in downtown Santiago and had been a former headquarters of the Chilean Socialist Party. Reclaiming or recuperating the site from the hands of what had become a right-wing institute took several years and a great deal of struggle for families of the disappeared, families of assassinated political prisoners, and left-wing activists. Rightists did not want to give up the site. The government was initially quite wary of supporting the reclaiming. As a place of so much torture and death, it was also important to do forensics work there. In 2005, activists finally scored a victory, and the National Council of Monuments declared Londres 38 a national monument, granting the site protection and preservation status. The site was inaugurated in 2008 and is today a vibrant center of guided visits, workshops, and organized actions that commemorate the past with a clear eye on the present. They practice an agenda that pays deep respect to the memories of revolutionary commitments toward combating violence against today's marginalized. During the several guided visits I've taken there with both US and Chilean students, I've appreciated the constant self-reflection and critique on the part of Londres 38 guides as they engage with visitors. At Londres 38, guides think out loud with visitors and then ask questions about why they're there and what the visitors are experiencing. For US students, the Chilean guides sometimes raise questions about what they feel in light of the fact that the US was deeply complicit in the destabilization of Salvador Allende and subsequently lent tacit support to the military regime during its very early and most brutal years. The directness to US students forces visitors to try to articulate both what drew them into the site and what unnerves them once they're there. As a teacher who's taken university students to major memory sites in Chile, Argentina, and Peru, I've argued elsewhere that a critical dimension of what sticks with US students after their visits takes place when they experience empathic unsettlement, a dynamic exchange, spoken or unspoken during their encounters with exhibits and narrators, a dynamic that jars, that unsettles, that reframes their thinking and emotions in productive ways, that moves them toward trying to understand one another while appreciating that the trauma or injury of another is largely beyond total understanding. Settlement may be even more powerfully at work when visitors can connect traumatic or violent memory of their national identities as well as their own lived experiences. We can imagine empathic unsettlement, that middle ground between engagement and disruption, as a moment where critical pedagogy can be at its best. Londres 38 activists also consistently seek to establish the connections between past and current activism, and they maintain engagement with contemporary Chilean social movements like the student movement, the women's rights movement, and the Mapuche indigenous movement. Research supports the finding that Chilean visitors do make connections among the violence, fear, and sense of political threat of the past with the many dimensions of police repression during mobilizations in the present. For much of the world familiar with the Chilean dictatorship, the black and white photographs of the detentions at the Estadio Nacional, which circulated in the international press, remain iconic, even though the stadium only functioned that way for 3 months. The iconicity derives from the fact that from September to November of 1973, the stadium was the dictatorship's largest detention center, with as many as 20,000 prisoners from Chile and 38 other countries. The struggle to establish the Estadio Nacional as a memorial site proved long and fraught, and it's remarkable that today, amidst the fact that the stadium also functions as the country's premier sports and major concert arena, there is an incredibly active, multi-generational group of memorial activists, first organized by women, former political prisoners, who've made the memorial a space that's widely visited and very dynamic. It's also striking that many of the stadium spaces where the most brutal activity took place in 1973 had been virtually untouched for almost 40 years. This is Escotilla Ocho, one of the hatches underneath the bleachers where torture took place, was unused during all this time. And what was the women's locker room, where women political prisoners were largely detained, had become a kind of ruin, used occasionally for the swimming pool, but never updated. This provided an opportunity for the memorial projects to engage with the way material ruins can evoke the stadium's brief history as a site of detention and torture. In this sense, the multiple uses of the stadium spaces with contradictory purposes and effective modes forms a part of the stadium's history as a work ever in completion, ongoing, in movement. Among the Estadio Nacional's several memorial projects, including major sculptures, exhibits, and guided pathways, I want to focus on the most dramatic of the spatial transformations, the locker room, where the women and foreigners were detained, which had largely been a dark and empty space of peeling paint. To transform it into the Memorial de Mujeres, the women's memorial, the architect Claudio Guerra designed a gleaming, transparent glass exterior over the entrance to the building that brings warmth and light to part of its interior. The space is now an integral part of the memorial, where people participate in guided visits, conduct educational workshops, and gather for cultural activities. The stadium's also become a major site for commemorative performances, events, and protests, including the September 11th, 1973 commemoration, and on March 8th, International Women's Day, which is coming up for this Friday. There's also a huge mobilization in Chile. Each March 8th, the Estadio Nacional hosts a celebration in commemoration of women former political prisoners who were held at the stadium decades ago. And here you see the gleam of the exterior of the redesigned women's locker room. Evening ceremonies are multi-generational and participatory, reflecting the organization's aim to present performance, theater, and the arts as forums for human rights discourse and commemoration. 2 years ago, for example, a knitting collective that met each week in the women's locker room for several weeks prior to the March 8th event presented a large tapestry with individual bordered fabrics for each of the estimated 1,400 women who'd been imprisoned there. Surviving former prisoners offered brief testimonies and remembered former fellow prisoners who had recently passed away. Former prisoner Ruth Vuskovic sung songs from the Spanish Civil War and from Violeta Parra. The ceremony ended with the harmonious and somber voices of the 9-member professional women's choir, Femme Vocal. In what can feel like a desolate and haunting space, the locker room was reclaimed and recoded to commemorate what women political prisoners had endured, to mourn the passing of several former prisoners in recent years, and to signal the power of women to preserve, create, and to resist injustices then and now. The memory projects at the stadium have attracted younger generations of Chileans to participate as guides, artists, workshop facilitators, event organizers, and more. For some, participation has been a way to gain knowledge about their own family members, a kind of post-memory experience. 26-year-old Mauricio Jofre, a psychologist, traveled to the stadium each week to conduct guided visits for visitors and school groups. After months of his involvement with the stadium, he learned from his own family that he had an uncle who'd been a member of the GAP, the group of personal friends that had served as Salvador Allende's personal bodyguards during his presidency. His participation with the Estadio Nacional, Memoria Nacional organization thus opened up a site, once a silent familial space in relation to the past. Young volunteers organized a weekly film series and invited Estadio Nacional documentarian Carmen Paró to facilitate a discussion session after the film's showing. Parot discussed her surprise at the large numbers of young people in the audience. One young woman thanked Parot and said she'd come to see the documentary because her father had been a prisoner in the stadium but never talked about it. For many others, participation is more explicitly political, a search to retrieve a sense of an inspired and somewhat romanticized previous political generation, and massive discontent with Chile's current political leadership. Stark social inequality, racism against the Mapuches, who are labeled terrorists for their campaigns to reclaim land, the exposure of widespread political and corporate corruption have together created a politics, I think some of us can understand this, in which younger generations in particular seek new collective political identities and affiliations. From participation in the Estadio Nacional, Memoria Nacional events, younger post-dictatorship generations of Chileans situate the memories of the dictatorship's militants in relation to contemporary political struggles. The March 8th Women's Tapestry Project, for example, was initiated by 37-year-old activist Maria Jose Cox, who's seated in the middle here, who explained that her participation was a way to honor her grandmother, who had visited the dictatorship's women political prisoners in jail every Saturday. The Intergenerational Women's Knitting Collective continues to plan projects. Stadium activists and teachers, Angelica Espinosa and Camila Paredes, who are also seated here, became involved through a 2015 political history workshop at the stadium, and they're now work to develop a children's storytelling project there. Espinosa grew up in a leftist political and extremely poor family. Working with the stadium had given her a feeling of belonging, she said. For lyrical singer Moises Mendoza and his partner, musician and music teacher Luis Valencia, their work as guides has offered instructive ways to connect past human rights violations and issues with those of the present, including gay rights, immigrant rights, and the rights of the Mapuches. Mendoza and Valencia also arrange musical events at the stadium. And here's from last September 11th's event, where a huge choir performed in the stadium and a professional orchestra performed. Every year on the anniversary of September 11th, the date of the coup, performances, events, workshops, and exhibitions are organized. And this year's, and the last year's, an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 people participate each time. Individuals, friends, and families walk through the Escotilla Ocho to the benches, listening to music and to testimonies, lighting candles, and at particular moments, voicing their disappointment with the center-left generation of political elites who've governed on and now off for nearly 3 decades. The stadium memory projects also demonstrate the integration of memory into a space of everyday familial life, as memory events at the stadium are focused on contemporary injustices, inequality, and a critique of the political status quo. It's perhaps ironic that this unlikely space of sports and entertainment that was so easily repurposed for violent repression has been so effectively repurposed, first by women, for political renewal. Major memorial sites are spaces of instruction and sometimes of transformation. Moreover, and in spite of the explosion of virtual or internet access and online exploration of sites, more and more people are physically visiting museums of memory and memorial sites around the world. Increased museum going underscores the value of personal human experience and interaction within the physical spaces, including the ways such spaces facilitate face-to-face connection, learning, and relationships. As a demonstration of the fluidity of memory debates in relation to the here and now, the recent broad defense of the Museo de la Memoria speaks to both the institutionalization of a narrative regarding the atrocities of the dictatorship, and in the immediate term, to the conjunctural struggles against a rightist government's looming threat to roll back social reforms in a progressive imagination. The fluidity also allows for critical symbols of past struggles to be adopted in current ones, perhaps best illustrated by the green handkerchiefs of the reproductive rights movements in Argentina and Chile, who appreciably borrow from the Madres de Plaza de Mayo of Argentina, albeit for quite distinct political reasons. New debates are resurfacing more visibly in Chile regarding the silencing of violent histories of racist repression against the indigenous and the ways such histories are reproduced over generations. Memory can open up debates regarding the relationship between terror of the past and the use of terrorism laws to thwart Mapuche demands. Taken together, I would argue that the varied memorialization efforts presented here awaken the dead, reckon with pasts that continue to haunt, and connect what are sometimes disparate collectivities through shared recognition and possibility. Memorial projects expand our understandings of temporality and space toward new kinds of connections across difference through shared mourning and recognition. Recognition, understood as a conscious act of seeing and listening, can open conversations, can presence a past, and explore such political questions as why and what could have or should have been in ways that potentially invite connection, action, and less violent, less unjust possibility going forward. Thank you.